I'm excited to welcome you to the absolute best video on an introduction to JavaScript you'll find anywhere on YouTube. In this video, I cover everything you need to know in detail and use interactive animations, beautiful illustrations, and professional editing to ensure you remain engaged in order to maximize your learning. So let's jump in. So let's start off nice and slow and discussing what is JavaScript. JavaScript is a programming language enabling dynamic interaction and manipulation of web page content. To understand JavaScript, let's take a look at the other web technologies inside the browser. We have HTML, which is all about the content. We have CSS, which is all about visual styling. And then we have JavaScript, which is all about interactivity. Now, when I was taught JavaScript, this word interactivity was thrown around a lot, but it isn't so clear what this actually means. For example, on this web page here, if I hover over these elements, I would call this interactive. But this is just CSS, specifically using the transition property. So what does interactive actually mean when we use it to describe JavaScript? So let's understand this by going back to the analogy I've used in my HTML and CSS full courses. I'm using a PowerPoint presentation to explain the role of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Inside PowerPoint, HTML is equivalent to just the content. Elements like headings, paragraphs, ordered lists, and images. So HTML is the content. CSS is then responsible for the visual styling. So properties like color, font weight, background color, spacing properties like margin and padding, as well as overall layout, like a grid layout over here. Now, we refer to HTML and CSS as static. That is, we can't use those languages to actually modify the content. So for example, in PowerPoint, I could come along and print this slide off. It's static, visually styled content on a piece of paper. But what JavaScript allows us to do on a web page is modify the content and styling on our page. We can think of JavaScript as the PowerPoint program itself. For example, JavaScript allows me to add new content to our web page. I'll add another comedian I like. It allows us to remove content. And it also allows us to change the visual styling. So for example, with JavaScript, I could change the word seen to bold. So think of JavaScript as the PowerPoint application itself. It allows us to modify HTML content and CSS styles on our web page. It's very different to just static HTML and CSS, which you could think of as this slide printed off. Compare that now to this slide inside PowerPoint, where the PowerPoint application gives me the ability to modify the content and style of the slide. So let's go check out HTML, CSS, and JavaScript independently on a web page. This is one of my favorite games. It's called Wordle. You're given the outline of a country, and you have 6 guesses to work out which one it is. And each time you guess, you're shown how close you are to the target country. Each day, Wordle resets to a new country. Now, I'm inside Safari, which is not my browser of choice, but the Safari browser has a really easy way to disable JavaScript and CSS. So I'm going to come to Development. I'm going to click Disable JavaScript. And I'm also going to click Disable Styles. I'm going to zoom out quite a bit. All of this is now just the raw HTML content. Most of this is just ads. And here's the actual content for Wordle. You can see we have some images, icons, a text input, and a button. Okay, that's HTML, just the web page content. Let's now go untick Disable Styles. So here we are, back to what it looked like before, but you'll see nothing works. If I try put in a guess and click Guess, it just says you need to enable JavaScript to run this app. So this is our static web page, just with HTML and CSS. But for this game to work, we need JavaScript so that web page content can update, and it's able to run some calculations in the background to assess our guess. So let's go untick Disable JavaScript. I'm going to guess Egypt. I'll click Guess, and everything you're seeing now is powered by JavaScript. JavaScript has updated this page to display Egypt, how far away I am from the target country, the direction, as well as how close I am in terms of distance. So you can see JavaScript has added interactivity to this page. That is, it's no longer a static page, but dynamic, where the page's content is able to update. And of course, there's calculations happening behind the scenes to output this information. Okay, I play this game daily, so my knowledge of what countries look like has become pretty good. This is Kazakhstan, which according to Borat is the #1 exporter of potassium. Alright, so hopefully you're getting a good feeling of what JavaScript is doing. It's allowing us to turn our web pages from static pages to dynamic pages. Now, I want to explore this in a bit more detail. I really want you walking away from this, having a real understanding of what JavaScript is doing. And to properly understand this, in this next section, we're going to be doing a deep dive on the evolution of the web. So HTML, CSS, and JavaScript emerged at different times to meet the web's evolving needs. I'm going to pop a timeline over here, and we're looking at this range of dates here, starting at 1990 all the way up to the present day. The first key date is 1991. This is when HTML was invented. The next key date is 1996, when CSS was added to web pages, and then in 1997, JavaScript was added to the browser. Now for each of these languages, new releases have continuously enhanced web structure, style, and functionality. So let's start off our journey by looking at more detail of the evolution of HTML. In 1991, the first HTML web page was developed for sharing scientific work. Back in those days, there were only text-based computers that looked like this, and an HTML web page would have looked like this. You can see over here in red is what we call the command line. That is how you interacted with these pages. You didn't have a mouse or graphical UI to move around and click. Everything was text-based through a command line. Now this is what the world's first web page would have looked like, but just to show you a page you'd be familiar with, this is what the Google homepage would look like on a text-based computer. So up until this point, HTML on a text-based computer wasn't so useful for people like you and I, but it helped scientists easily share their work. Then in 1995, graphic-based browsers leads to widespread adoption of HTML. So this is what the world's first web page would look like on a graphical computer. And here's what one of the first browsers looked like. It was called Netscape, and it allowed people like you and I to access the World Wide Web, where all we would see are HTML pages. Here's what the early Amazon.com webpage looked like in HTML only. We have some simple headings, some hyperlinks, and some paragraph text. Now I'm going to be using Amazon.com throughout this next part to see how CSS and JavaScript have made the web so much more sophisticated. Now to get a real understanding of what JavaScript is doing, I want us to get a sense of what's happening on each layer of a web application. We have our front end, which we call the client. This displays content and handles user interactions. It's what you and I are interacting with in our browser. So on the front end, we see HTML. On our back end, which we call the server, this takes user requests to provide a response. It's just a whole bunch of code. A server-side language around in the early days of the web would be something like PHP. And then we have our database, which stores and manages data that users need. An example of a popular database language is SQL. So let's say I'm on Amazon.com and I want to buy some coffee. So the user inputs coffee on the front end. This goes to the back end. The back end applies some logic and searches for coffee in the database. The database will send back a list of all the coffee available on Amazon.com. And then the back end generates an HTML page with the coffee available in stock. Our web page then updates to show the list of available coffee. So what's really important here to understand is that a new HTML page loads for each request. Now I want you to keep that fact in the back of your mind, because when we look at JavaScript in a bit, we're going to see the power of what it's able to do. All right, let's move on to CSS now. The first key date is in 1996, when CSS is introduced to add visual styling to HTML. So looking at our Amazon.com webpage, it's no longer just HTML. We do have some CSS that adds properties like color, as well as some basic UI, like this navigation bar over here. Looking back at the full stack, we're adding CSS to our front end, and now a new styled HTML page loads for each request. So the page is styled, but the important fact is that a new page is still loading for each request. The next key date is 2012, when media queries are introduced for responsive layouts. So our web pages now have a responsive layout, so a better design for mobile devices. Back to our full stack, all that's happening now is that our styled page is also responsive. The next key date is 2017, where CSS now allows for flexible layouts with Flexbox and Grid. So the Amazon homepage now looks like this, where we're using Flexbox as well as Grid layout to design much better pages. Looking again in our full stack, our styled pages are not only responsive, they're responsive with flexible layouts. Okay, so up until this point, we're able to make beautiful HTML and CSS pages. But every time we send a new request on Amazon.com, like searching for coffee, adding the coffee to our cart, a new styled HTML page has to load. So now let's go see what JavaScript is able to do. The first key date is 1997, when JavaScript is added to the browser for simple interactivity. Going back to an older version of Amazon.com, an example of very simple interactivity is in the bottom right over here, where we could show or hide more books. Now this show or hide toggle is updating web page content. Depending on whether you're showing or hiding, it's adding or removing content to the web page. And to do this, you need JavaScript. So let's now look at our full stack. We now have JavaScript in the front end, where a new styled HTML page with basic interactivity loads for each request. So yes, JavaScript has added some basic interactivity, but anytime we send a request, we still need to generate a new HTML page. The next key date is 2001, where asynchronous data loading allows for some live content updates without page reloads. Alright, there's a scary word there, asynchronous. Don't worry so much about that right now. We're going to be exploring this as an entire topic later on in the course. But now this is the start of the real power of JavaScript. Looking back at Amazon, this is a typical shopping cart for me. I need more dummies for my newborn baby and more coffee for me to help me with those early mornings. Now we're always losing these dummies, so I tend to go a bit crazy and add a whole bunch of these to my basket. So when I'm increasing the quantity, the number changes. That is from a 1 to a 2. Now this is just a tiny piece of UI that's changing, a simple change from 1 to 2. And up until this point, this would require an entire page reload. That is, all of this content and styling would need to be reloaded into the browser just to simply change the number 1 to the number 2. And the same thing for the subtotal up in the top right, because the number of dummies I'm ordering has changed. So that means that the subtotal, the number of items, and the price needs to update. So the numbers need to change over here, from 2 items and £19 to 3 items and £28. So these are tiny, tiny changes of the overall content on the web page. So what asynchronous JavaScript allows us to do is actually just update those numbers without requiring the entire page to reload. So let's go through a new flow. I now increase the quantity of dummies on my front end. The back end then saves and updates the quantity and cost on the database. The database then confirms the updated quantity and cost and sends it to the backend, and the backend updates the quantity and cost on the HTML page. So really importantly, with the power of asynchronous JavaScript, some content is able to update without a full HTML page reload. And this makes navigating and using a web page a lot faster. Now I just want to highlight at this point, what we just saw before was very small changes, like numbers on the page. If, for example, I added a new item to the cart, that would still require a full page reload. So I do just want to highlight at this point, JavaScript is only able to update small bits of content, like numbers, without requiring a full HTML page reload. Okay, let's continue on in our journey. In 2009, Node.js allows JavaScript on the server side. So JavaScript was initially created as a front-end language that is used in your browser, but JavaScript is now available on the backend through Node.js. This topic forms an entire course in my full-stack web development bootcamp. I wouldn't worry too much about Node.js for this course. This course just focuses on JavaScript on the front end. Alright, so the final date we need to look at is 2011. And this is where we have the growth of complex single-page applications, SPAs for short, like Angular, React, and Vue. So let's go check out what these frameworks are able to do. So let's look back at our shopping cart. What these frameworks do is essentially create what are called different components of pieces of user interface. So for example, we have these 2 product card details in my cart, which we would call a product component. We then have our cart total, which we would call the price component. And then down the side, we have related products, which we would call the related product component. Now let's say I want to add some dummy clips to my basket. I would click the Add to Basket button over here. And doing this adds the product to my cart, like this. So the product component is added. Now obviously the price and items have changed, so the price component needs to be updated, so it'll change from this to this. So with the power of these JavaScript frameworks like React, Vue, and Angular, we're able to essentially slice our page into different components and just update content for any components that need to change. In the example I just went through here, we added a new product component and we updated the price component. So earlier, just with asynchronous JavaScript, we were very limited in what we could update. like numbers for the amount of items and price. But what these front-end frameworks allow us to do is update different pieces of UI without requiring a full HTML page reload. So let's now look at this in diagram form. On our front end, we now have JavaScript frameworks. With the example of the shopping cart, on the front end, we add a new product. This is sent to our backend, which saves and updates the quantity and cost on our database. Our database confirms the updated quantity and cost and sends it back to our backend. And our backend tells the front end to add the product and update pricing. So instead of an entire page reload, the web page remains as it is, but just a new product component is added. So now we're in a place where only the necessary content is updated without a full page reload. Alright, so I've gone into a lot of detail in this video, but I hope you're able to walk away understanding what JavaScript is actually able to do. Yes, it adds interactivity to a web page, but I hope you'll now see there's a lot more going on here. And I also hope it gets you excited about exploring this topic with me. So let's wrap up by building a summary card, Introduction to JavaScript. JavaScript is a programming language enabling dynamic interaction and manipulation of web page content. We explored what this actually means by looking at the evolution of the web. Focusing just on JavaScript, in 1997, JavaScript is added to the browser and allows for very simple interactivity, like showing and hiding content. And we need JavaScript for this because just HTML and CSS is static. In order to show or hide content, JavaScript is needed. And as a reminder, at this point, anytime we send a new request from our front end, we still require a full page reload. In 2001, JavaScript introduces asynchronous updates. This allows small pieces of content, like numbers in a shopping cart, to update without a full page reload. And this now significantly improves web browsing experience because pages are able to load a lot faster. In 2009, we get Node.js, which allows us to use JavaScript on the backend as a server-side language. And then in 2011, we get a growth of SPAs, that is, single-page applications, which are frameworks like Angular, React, and Vue. And we saw how these slices up our page into different components, and instead of a full HTML page reload, only the content that's necessary to update gets updated. If you've enjoyed this style of teaching and are looking at mastering JavaScript, you can join me in my JavaScript full course, which is available for free on my channel. The course is designed for complete beginners and covers everything you need to know to code JavaScript at a professional level. In the course, you'll experience the same high-quality teaching and build a whole range of real-life projects from scratch. Join me today and also make sure to subscribe to the channel to stay in the loop with new releases. See you in the JavaScript full course.